Our next speaker is Tom Kaye. He's the chief scientist for the Institute for Applied Ecology, and when it comes to native seed, he's a major go-to. I hadn't met him in person until last night, and I was immediately struck by just how kind and friendly he is, and I'm really glad that native plants have him on their side. Welcome.
Thanks, Kaye. Very nice. Hi, everybody. It's really hard to follow that act. I was thinking, okay, it's middle of the afternoon after lunch. We're all gonna have to stand up and stretch to wake you up. I don't think so. I think you're good. So let's go for it. So yeah, I'm Tom Kaye. I'm with the Institute for Applied Ecology, which is a nonprofit organization in Corvallis, and I'm an ecologist, but really I'm a botanist. And I'm kind of a seed nut, which is redundant because nuts are seeds. But I'm really interested. I've always, as a botanist, been really interested in everything about plants. How do they make seeds? How do the seeds survive? How do the seeds germinate? How do the seedlings establish? How do they grow? And I did my PhD dissertation on plant demography, really summing all of that up. It's really, I don't know. I love all this stuff. So, I want to go back. This picture on the right is some illustrations of seeds that I saw hanging on the wall at the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden yesterday. And it was so cool that I had to take a picture of it and put it up there. So thanks, Santa Barbara Botanic Garden. So the mission of the organization I work for is to conserve native species and habitats through restoration, research, and education. And we do all of that. We have about 55 employees in Corvallis, Oregon, and in Santa Fe, New Mexico. We about double that in the summers with seasonals. So it's a great group of people to work with, and we get a lot done. Today I've really got three big messages for you. Okay, so this is the overview, and then we'll get into it. Plants and their diversity are important to human and environmental health. Important is probably the biggest understatement I'll make today. Climate change and habitat loss are affecting native plants and forward. So I'm going to reverse that. Affecting is the other big understatement I'm going to make today. And then, but climate-centered restoration is crucial. We're facing this pivotal moment on Earth, and certainly in human time on Earth, and that needs to be something we are focusing on when we're doing restoration. It's not a sidebar, it's the bar, as far as I'm concerned. So, yeah, plants are cool. They smell nice. They're pretty. But yeah, they are also really important. And without them, of course, we would not survive. And native plants are the stuff of the diversity on planet Earth that keeps the Earth a resilient place for humans to live. And it starts with the fact that plants are the base of the food chain. It's actually, I'll put it another way. Plants are the only organisms on Earth that can turn sunlight into life. They turn sunlight into life. Otherwise, we wouldn't have life here. And so this is the Calvin cycle, not the Krebs cycle, Jesus. The Calvin cycle, which is photosynthesis. This is what happens when sunlight hits a plant and the plant brings in carbon dioxide and uses sunlight to fix that carbon dioxide into sugars and other carbons and create energy. This is the magic, and it depends on having a wide diversity of plants in an ecosystem for this to be a really stable, functioning process. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. And I'm going to, Peggy said, plant diversity was the most important thing. We also heard that maybe it's just genetic diversity. It's genes, it's not plants. Well, it's the genes in the plants that matter. So I'm going back to the plants, and yeah, they got genes. You're right. First off, people need nature. It's in our nature to be here. We have to make connection for our mental health. We actually go crazy without contact with nature. It's really important for us. And it might be you just need a walk in a park to calm down, but it might be you need it every day to just remain centered and remember what you're doing in the world and deal with all the other problems we have. But there's a problem happens here for us when we're separated from nature. And we may have these places we go, and there's a word for this separation from nature and the grief we feel, I feel, when I see our natural world trammeled and destroyed. It's called solastalgia. When you break it down, it's basically having nostalgia for places that give us solace. And without those, when we see this, it's for many of us, this is a gut punch. I can't live on that planet. I need the green one. So I guess I'm really trying to say that, taking care of our green world is taking care of ourselves. And the benefits of exposure to nature are extreme. So when we have in this country, we have I can't remember, 2 million people incarcerated. They are separated from nature. But when even inmates who are or adults in custody are given imagery of the natural world, it gives them benefits. There's a 25% reduction in violent acts in incarcerated people's populations when they're given exposure to even imagery of nature. I mean, that's sort of the minimum amount of natural contact you can get, and that has a strong effect on us. Peggy also mentioned the Sagebrush in Prisons project. This is one of the projects we work on with BLM, where we work with the departments of corrections, and their adults in custody actually manage native plant nurseries to produce sagebrush. And while they're doing that, they are caring for living organisms. And that act of caring, that act of nurturing, centers people and gives them very tangible benefits. Another aspect of this is not just mental health, but physical health. We think of ourselves as individual. I'm this individual who, I don't know why I'm wearing a tie, but I'm not an individual, right? I am trillions of organisms. I am a microbiome on legs, and I can't live without this enormous community in me and on me. And one thing that folks are finding is that there's this thing called the microbiome rewilding hypothesis. And there's a group of organisms, of bacteria and fungi and other things that are, some people would call our old friends. This is called the old friends hypothesis. These are the microbiome components that actually we've evolved with and make us healthy. And when we have a green environment that's been sort of sterilized, it's just like stripped down to lawn, that microbiome is no longer full of our old friends. It's full of opportunists and organisms that can be pathogenic to us. And the more we start to rewild and rejuvenate that landscape, stepping down from the top down, we start planting trees and planting the understory and getting it back to a natural condition, the more it starts to develop a microbiome of itself that contains those old friends that are good for us. And so on the right-hand side, you can see all these little dots that I guess are microbiome things getting on people, and it gets onto us from the soil, it gets onto us from plants, leaves. If we live near a park and we open the window, it gets on us because the wind's coming in. So it's not just the fresh air, it's the fresh life that we're getting. And we need that. We need that to remain healthy. And the data is getting more and more clear about this. And of course, it's not all about me and it's not all about humans. It's about the way the earth works. So plant diversity creates, yes, a diverse microbiome that's good for people, but it also has these ecosystem benefits, ecosystem functions. It's just good for the world. And this is a experimental site called the Cedar Creek Ecosystem Science Reserve in the upper Midwest. And this is one of the first places where ecologists did massive experiments. An experiment like this is kind of like, to an ecologist, this is like what a super collider is to a physicist. This is like, we're going to do a really cool big experiment. And each of these little cells is a piece of ground where the experimenters have manipulated the number of plant species that are growing there, just the number of species, right? And and this is the first place where this very cool aspect of why biodiversity matters. Why does diversity really matter? Well, one of the main things that it does is it creates stability in ecosystem productivity. And there's this ecologist, very famous now, David Tillman, who established this, that the more species that were packed into each of these squares there were, the more even the productivity, the green biomass that was produced from year to year was. In other words, there's good years and there's bad years, or there's wet years and dry years, and different plants think those are good or bad. And the more species you have there evens that out. It's kind of like having a stock portfolio that has lots of different stocks in it. You don't want to do that thing like on Downton Abbey where they invest in just one railroad in the US and the whole thing goes down and the family goes broke. You want to have a nice broad investment. You need a nice broad species diversity that when adverse things happen, you've got something to shuffle into place. And this was an emergent property from biological diversity. It was really one of the first times ecologists demonstrated that diversity isn't just cool, it's the rule. You need to do it. Okay, it's really important. Then there was this other experiment, another place that did one of these botanical super colliders, the Jena experiment in Germany. And the effects on plant diversity that they found there, or they've written, I don't know, like 400 published papers on this thing. It's ridiculous. But some of it's the syntheses of this is really interesting. As the diversity of plants goes up, and that's all they're manipulating is the diversity of plants goes up, the diversity of all of the organisms in the soil goes up, and the diversity of all of the organisms above ground goes up. All of the kinds of organisms, birds, mammals, pollinators, you name it, with one exception. Any guess what the exception is? No, good one though. I think it's all the same humans, but it's invasive species. The more diversity of these plants there were, the fewer invasives got in there. So there's this sort of interlocking protection that happens when you have high diversity of plants. So very cool. I want to go back and say one thing. When ecologists and botanists talk about diversity, one of the ways we initially historically called that was species richness. Species richness. That's a historic term. It's still used. And it just tells you that we had this innate sense that this diversity is of value. It's a beautiful thing that we're inheriting that conveys wealth, richness to us. Okay, so it's something we just get. Okay, and on the other hand, welcome to the Anthropocene. We're pumping CO2 and methane into the atmosphere. Things are getting warmer. It kind of sucks, but here we are. These are just some graphs from the Oregon area where I live, but you've seen these before. The top graph shows you that temperatures have gone up and are going up more. And if there's one thing we know, that these figures are already out of date, that they're actually going up faster. And then in Oregon, it looks like the precipitation is going to stay about the same. There might be some seasonal differences in snow. And so it's easy to be complacent a little bit and think, oh, okay, it's going to be just as wet. That's cool. At least we'll have wet. The problem is when it's warmer, even if you have the same amount of moisture, it's drier because that moisture is being pulled out of the soil and into the atmosphere and not available to plant roots. That's what's really the bummer. Okay, so what's going on with climate change? I'm probably going to talk too long, so I'll stop whenever that bell goes off. So some effects of climate change on plants. Well, there's a loss of biological diversity, loss of species richness. There's a study in the Klamath Siskiyous a few years ago where some folks went back to plots that had been established around 1950, and they resampled those same places. These were plots that were put out by I can't remember his name, one of the more famous ecologists. Anyway, what they found was about 70 to 80% reduction in species richness in these same plots. What? And the pattern of that loss was mostly species that had their distributions more further to the north. So they're getting trimmed out. This is a climate change signal. As it warms up, these species that are northern species can't make it in the south. So their trailing end of their range starts moving north. And also it was on north slopes, there were starting to be more south slope species. So some of these southern warmer things, Mediterranean species, are becoming more abundant. But overall, a huge loss. Phenology, or changes in flowering time and other things like germination time, etc. Here's an example with California poppy. There's a several day, maybe a 3 or 4 day increase or earlier blooming with every degree of warming that's happening in California poppies overall. But it's more in areas that have been historically cool. Those places, the poppies are advancing their phenology, their flowering time faster. And in hot areas, not so much, because they're already acclimated to that heat. So there's some nuance to this. It's not just it's getting warmer, things are blooming earlier. Things bloom earlier under certain circumstances and less so on others. It's complicated. And there's been a whole bunch of papers that look at this the same way. You look at old herbarium specimens and recent herbarium specimens and track when they were collected and when things were flowering on them. And one in the Pacific Northwest showed the same thing. They looked at 19 different species and very much the same pattern. Plants in cooler, more coastal areas are advancing their flowering much more quickly than plants east of the Cascades in hotter, drier areas. So yeah, it's happening. It's happening now. It's already happened. This isn't a forecast. This is a backcast to what's already occurred. Other species like this rosy checker mallow, Sidalcia virgata, was part of a study where some folks in Oregon and Washington, they actually seeded grasslands and then manipulated the temperatures and the precipitation to mimic climate change. And what they found was some species started to die out when they increased temperature and reduced moisture. And some genotypes, when moved north, did fine when they warmed up the climate. So it's not just the species, sometimes it's the genes in the species that are responding or causing the plants to respond in different ways. Trees, oh my God, the stories with trees are crazy. Trees are succumbing to drought, and when they're stressed, they're succumbing to pathogens like beetles and diseases. And this was a study by Monteleon and Lintz in PLOS One, and what they found was they looked at 14,000 forest plots across the Pacific Northwest and found that some tree species, about 30 tree species, were unable to reproduce in the environment where the standing trees were now. There was a difference in temperature tolerance between adults and seedlings. And that means that some of these tree populations, they're not reproducing anymore in their location because of climate warming. What do you do about that? Well, let's talk about that in a minute. This is an orchid that I've worked on. We resurveyed sites that had been found on public land across California and Oregon, and we found that about 50% of the populations that had been recorded were no longer present. They're gone. 50%, 55%. And that was in part correlated with elevation. The predominant loss was at lower elevations, suggesting that it's the trailing edge. Things are moving uphill. It didn't appear, though, that they're moving uphill. There's not a lot of upward expansion. They're just getting narrowed. And so we're seeing lots and lots of extinction of populations. In this species, we did a demographic study, and we found that climate change is probably going to start pushing this population down of this species. This is Green's Mariposa lily. It's in Oregon and California. But that issue is worse in managed landscapes that include grazing by animals. So the effects of climate change on plants depends on how we manage the land. If we're stressing that land and there's climate change, the land is less able to be resilient. So we have opportunities to change management that will soften the effects of climate change. Okay, so where do we get our plants for habitat restoration in a changing climate? I'm going to have to kind of go quick here. Well, we know that local adaptation is important, but we also know that the climate is changing. So in this study, and this was brought up by someone else too, one of my fellow co-authors on this paper. Local adaptation is the rule in plants. This was a big review of common garden experiments. And we found that 95% of these studies showed that there was variation among populations of plants. Okay, well, that's normal. That's sort of the stuff of evolution. 86% of that variation was linked to the environment, and 75% was climate linked, suggesting that local adaptation is the rule and plants are mostly adapting to climate. That is the main signal they're paying attention to. It's not the only one, of course. And we know that soils, local predators, local pathogens, local everything matters. But there's a measurable local advantage. When you plant things from various places together, the one that's from that location wins. This is old data. So this was a review of many older papers. And so local is important, but with climate change, local isn't local anymore necessarily. So here's one of the things we do in my organization is we grow a lot of plants for seeds to do restoration. We use an approach called the composite mix, where we are collecting from a local region, but from many populations. So this is an example with Iris tenax, and there's the Willamette Valley ecoregion there. You can see all those little dots. They're all collection sites. So we pool those into one field, grow them. You can see our farm field here growing all this iris. And the iris is flourishing. All these plants are cross-pollinating with bumblebees. And so the progeny are all these seeds they're kind of hyper-diverse, right? Okay, so this is all local, though. This is not necessarily from a warmed climate. So what do we do about that? One of the things we're doing is using online tools like the seed lot selection tool to say, if we're working in the top area up there, where is our tomorrow climate today? So we can go there and get that genotype of the same species and add it to our mix. So this is called assisted gene flow or assisted gene transfer. And so what I'm advocating right now for is something called adaptive sourcing, where we do this thing we emphasize local adaptation, but we bring in genetic diversity by going to a lot of different populations. But we also want to bring in local populations that are experiencing very harsh conditions, dry conditions, maybe conditions of invasion by invasive species, so that those genotypes that are already tough on the landscape can be part of our seed mix. And then use those climate forecast tools to identify places where we could collect seeds that may have genes that are resilient to the climate change we are and will be facing, and stir those into the gene pool. It's not a replacement. This isn't a binary thing where you're saying, don't use local, use something else. It's help your local by stirring in a component. What percentage that is, I think, is up to a lot of debate, whether that's 1 to 5% or up to 20% or more. Some people have said 50-50. Some people have said use a model. Some people say, if you're talking about many generations, just a few percent will do it. You may not have many generations, though, time to get this done. So it can be controversial. So I'm going to end there, but with a statement that we also need to incorporate human diversity back into this process. This isn't just one business that will save us by growing a lot of seeds. And what's emerging on our landscape is a grassroots movement to create seed partnerships throughout the country. These are a group of agencies and companies that all do restoration that need seeds, and they're pooling their resources to get the seeds they need produced, whether they're farming them themselves or contracting to farmers or whatever. Everybody's got a different model for how they're doing this. There are over 30 that we know of now, and I know this list is incomplete. So this is a really interesting social movement, as well as something that's really important for our ecosystem recovery. We have a website called the Native Seed Network on which this kind of thing will be coming soon. And we're also hosting the National Native Seed Conference in a few weeks in Tucson, if this kind of thing really works for you. Thanks for putting up with me talking a little long. Oh, we had time for one question. Yeah.
That consortium, you said it's controversial for the percentages that you use, right?
Yeah.
What's your opinion? Maybe on like perennials, something like a grassland, like a cycla or like a milkweed?
I have to say that this is speculative at this time, but I would say we probably need to do something like between 10 and 20% mixing in. That's more than you need for long-term generations to work in beneficial genes. But because we're faced with rapid change and extreme environments, we don't want to have lots of plants die out and then new ones come in slowly. We need to tie the ground with native plants. So there's a really interesting paper from Brazil that came out recently by Silva et al. That actually attempts to model what the proportions should be of different types, local versus further away, and that's very interesting. And of course, what that says is this is nuanced and it depends. So, yeah. All right. Yeah. Thank you.